So this afternoon, we're going to be looking at some questions, and I'm just going to tell you what those were actually and what we put out, because I think it's useful to bear these in mind. The first question, given policymakers' tendencies to focus on short-term fixes, how can we citizens influence our leaders to improve their planning for future disasters? The second, humanity's ability to imagine our future is one of those things that makes us unique as a species, yet we have created looming systemic crises. Some people call this the polycrisis, that we seem powerless to fix: climate change, environmental destruction, overpopulation. How can we actually improve as a species on prioritizing the future? Very good question. And what do we owe to future generations and to the planet when it comes to preventing foreseeable disasters? And we in the West don't take the seventh generation into account, unlike indigenous cultures. So these are the sort of questions that we'll be looking at in the second half. And if you have questions of clarification or you'd like to put something in the chat during the discussions, then those immediate questions might be able to be addressed during the dialogues that Tim's going to be having with our speakers this afternoon. So Tim, welcome. Thank you for helping organize this afternoon. And I will now hand over to you.
All right, thank you, David. And it's my pleasure to moderate the first half of today's conversation. In this conversation, we're going to hear from two thought leaders and experts with deep expertise in these sorts of questions that David brought out. And I'll introduce them one at a time, and then I'll dive into our first conversation. First, I'm happy to introduce Anne Kabagambe, who is the author of a global playbook for the next pandemic. Anne served as executive director to the World Bank Group between 2016 and 2017, where she represented the interests of 22 sub-Saharan African countries. She's currently an independent director at Bart Gold Corporation, and Anne, for 35 years, has worked in senior leadership positions in various development institutions, including as chief of staff of the African Development Bank. She's a citizen of Africa, and she joins us from Kampala in Uganda today. Her colleague is Bart Édes. Bart is the author of Learning from Tomorrow: How Strategic Foresight Can Prepare us for the Next Big Disruption. Bart's an experienced international trade and development policy specialist, analyzing transformative trends that reshape Asia and the world. He's also a senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation in Vancouver, Canada. He's also worked for 19 years at the Asia Development Bank, where he oversaw teams responsible for education, knowledge management, health, and other operations. So they're bringing this wealth of global expertise to bear on this conversation. I'm going to start with questions for Bart and his book on strategic foresight, and then halfway through the hour, we'll turn our conversation to Anne. So Bart, your book is about strategic foresight. I'd like to start by asking you, what exactly is strategic foresight, and how is it different from forecasting or other ways that we have of predicting the future?
Thanks for the question, Tim, and thank you, David, for inviting Anne and myself to join the network for today's discussion. And welcome to those all over the world on different continents for the chat. Let me just start with showing the book that Tim is referencing. So, Learning from Tomorrow, as you see, is the title. And with regard to the question, Tim, strategic foresight is basically an approach to using ideas about the future to anticipate and better prepare for change. It involves exploring plausible alternative futures and the opportunities and challenges that may come with them. It's a system of tools, of methods that is best used in a context where we're looking 10 or 15 years into the future or beyond, and where there's a lot of uncertainty or complexity.
Mm-hmm. And how is it different than forecasting?
Well, forecasting, it's a prediction approach. It uses past data, current data to make predictions about typically the near term. to draw a distinction between the two. So predictions using data, imagine a graph, for example, with sales on it for some company. And predictions and forecasts were made for 2020 in the years 2018 or 2019. So companies, organizations were making their forecasts for 2020. And a few months into 2020, they had to rip up those forecasts and throw them in the rubbish bin because they were completely useless. In contrast, strategic foresight studies done, say, 10, 15 years ago, anticipated among the alternative plausible scenarios the emergence of a global pandemic, of the spread of disease. So very different tools. I don't mean to disparage completely forecasting, which has its role. One is more short-term and often looks backward and is heavily data-oriented. Strategic foresight draws on different disciplines, not only data, but also experience and qualitative information, and draws from areas like engineering and systems theory and sociology.
All right, great, thank you. So what I heard most clearly is that forecasting can't well anticipate big disruptions because it looks at, straight line projections. So my question then about foresight is, do you think it's something that is an innate human ability, or is it something that we've invented like calculus or economics?
I would say, Tim, that it is definitely innate. When you look at foresight as a future-oriented discipline, okay, we're looking into the future. We're trying to understand it, make some sense of uncertainty. And human beings, by their nature, we have a predilection toward the future. We are naturally curious. Over time, we've innovated. And think back centuries when you had shipping, you had vessels leaving ports in Europe, exploring the Atlantic Ocean and traveling the world. In more recent times, in recent decades, our interest in what lies beyond and in the future led us into space, to the moon, to Mars and beyond. So we have this innate interest in what will come. Strategic foresight requires some study and learning because it brings specific tools to the table to help, say, companies or organizations in the public or nonprofit sectors to make sense of what's next.
Okay, so how specifically could an organization, whether it's a company trying to look at its sales in several years, or a government trying to predict, well, what health disruptions might we face, how in practical terms does one go about putting the tools of strategic foresight into play?
Well, I could answer that question, Tim, by saying buy the book, which is already available on Barnes and Noble and Amazon, among other sites. But I'll give you a taste of strategic foresight in practice. And there's not one simple way or standard way that applies to all circumstances, but I can walk you through and the audience through a few steps that would be typical. And the first common step is to identify the issue or the problem that you're looking at. So focus a bit. It can be a big picture thing, or it can be something very specific. And let's use an example, since quite a number of our audience members are in Europe or have spent time there. Let's say we're interested in the United Kingdom's future trade and investment relationship with the EU. Let's pick 2040, very in line with strategic foresight, looking forward more than a decade. A next step, now that we have that issue and we want to examine that, is looking at the assumptions in our thinking. So if we're assuming, as we start a foresight study on UK economic relations with the EU, if we're starting with the assumption that the United Kingdom will be exactly the same come 2040, we may be making an incorrect assumption. I mean, what is currently the UK may be different if, for example, Scotland secedes between now and 2040. So we look at the variety of assumptions around the question. Next, we would move to a horizon scan. And there we're looking for weak signals. Weak signals are early indicators of a wild card or a trend. Now, wild card is a low probability event that could have a big impact. And a trend is pretty straightforward, something that's been established and we can see movement in some area of life around us. The next step would be mapping the systems and identifying drivers of change. So drivers of change are like factors that lead to some phenomenon. These are critical. The drivers of change around us are the building blocks of scenarios. And to emphasize, Tim, when we're talking about strategic foresight, ultimately, it's usually a case of building alternative scenarios that help us plan today for different types of possibilities, different futures. So these drivers of change, see how they interact in a system and develop from there 3 or 4 alternative scenarios. The last step, if I may, is then to use those insights, these scenarios to assist in your planning and preparation for tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. And so in the quite obvious example of the pandemic, what might a government, right now, for example, here in the US, the government is planning on doing some massive investments. What might they do in anticipating future health disasters that could take advantage of strategic foresight?
Let me expand that generally beyond just health risks and pandemics, where Anne's going to give us some great insights in a bit to talk about, say, emergencies or disasters in general. And that could involve both natural and human-caused events. If I were to recommend 3 things in this context for governments, wherever they may be situated, the first would be to invest in disaster risk reduction, in proper management of the process of preparing for disasters. And that includes communications and coordination. And I can cite as a good example of a government agency that does a good job of this, and that's the US Coast Guard. So the US Coast Guard, they have a system for helping with strategic planning, looking 15 to 20 years out. And every 4 years, they do a major foresight study to inform their planning for the future. And they are very much involved in disasters and emergencies. As climate change takes root, we'll have a case of rising seas, of intensifying storms, of flooding along coasts. And then you have other things that they have to deal with, including trends of drug trade from Caribbean islands to Florida, for example. So the Coast Guard has to be prepared for many different types of risks, including terrorism, and they have a system built in. So I would cite that, disaster risk reduction and planning. A second thing would be to stop incentivizing disasters. So what I mean by that is look at the case of coal. We are using coal liberally around the world, less so these days in North America where I'm based, but we continue to use it. And one of the reasons is that we have not factored in all of the costs of mining it, of moving it, of burning it, which brings pollution and environmental degradation, causes health problems, and all of those costs have not been figured into the price of coal. So if they were, then other forms of energy that are cleaner, that present less risk in the future, whether it be solar or wind, they're not used. The price differential is not a real one because coal is not properly priced. Another example in terms of incentivizing bad behavior and risk would be how we view floodplains. So there's an agency, another one in the US called FEMA, and they do mapping of floodplains, and they haven't updated their maps. And so you have people moving into areas near coasts or rivers or what have you that we know, the scientists have studied it. Those who are looking at hydrology and environmental trends, they can tell you that there are high risks of flooding. So the disaster that experienced many years ago in New Orleans and others since, we're exacerbating the risk of such disasters by not taking that into account, and zoning regulations at the local level that allow and encourage people to settle in spaces that are vulnerable to environmental and disasters. And the third thing I would recommend to government and to, in fact, any organization, Tim, whether it's academic, it's a charity, it's a business, is to begin a regular process of horizon scanning. So I refer to that in the steps of doing a foresight study. You don't necessarily need to launch a foresight study to begin your preparations for the future. And that is having a dedicated person or team looking at emerging signals that something that changes afoot, that might give rise to a wild card or a trend that could present great opportunities for business or better serving clients of a government agency, or present a serious risk that we need to prepare for. Risks, for example, of a pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Bart. You know, as you're speaking, one of the things that really seems to me a big problem that we have as humans is what's called the normalcy bias, which is the belief that things will go back to being normal, however we may design that. We'll sort of come back to a baseline. I remember in the relatively early days of the pandemic, late last spring, speaking with a friend of mine who works for Morgan Stanley, and I was saying, "Wow, so it looks like this is really going to, be disruptive in terms of how you guys predict what the market is doing." And he says, "Oh no, we only ever look 3 months out anyway. That's the maximum we look out." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? How can this be?" It's like they are only focused on those 3 months because that's where the returns on investment are coming that drive what their clients want to see. So it seemed in a lot of our organizations, companies, even governments, short-termism is built in, right? The US government with its 2-year election cycles, short-termism is really built in. So I'm wondering if you're seeing as an advocate for strategic foresight, any shift in this, and if perhaps the pandemic itself has made organizations start to become more sensitive to the importance of doing these, at least horizon scanning, if not other things you've talked about.
Tim, I have seen an explosion of interest in many different quarters. This crisis, which is the first big one for many people on a global scale, such as we've had, has caused them to rethink assumptions and how things might play out. And a number of organizations are building up capacity to study the future and trends. And it's in places you wouldn't maybe think of most obviously, in design, in fashion, in consumer retail. They are hiring people who do foresight or foresight-like futures work to help prepare for what may come next. And we've seen during the course of the pandemic over the last year, a number of changes in the way we live. And yes, that will further change as vaccination is expanded and as we get the virus under control everywhere, slowly but surely. But change will have occurred in some spaces, and we're not going back to the way. The new normal is what I'm trying to get at. A new normal is not going to be the normal we left behind in the first quarter of 2020.
Mm-hmm. So Bart, it's somebody who spent so many of your years, your career years, working in the Asia Development Bank, and I'm also mindful of Anne's work in the Africa Development Bank. What capacity do poorer countries have to take on these sorts of foresight exercises? Is there likely to be a foresight gap between what rich and powerful countries can do and smaller nations?
No, we certainly see a gap in so many ways, including right now in the distribution of vaccines, with rich countries getting them before poor countries. So, and we've seen the digital gap and many other gaps. I guess in a more positive light, access to strategic foresight is, if not egalitarian or fully democratized, it is being used in many developing country contexts. So in Asia, the region of the world where I've been most active in development and such, living in Southeast Asia for most of the last 2 decades, you have foresight specialists acting and influencing governments and how to prepare. You have some leading global experts based in places like Pakistan, in Malaysia, in the United Arab Emirates, in South Africa, in Latin America as well. So I know a team of academics worked with the government in Brazil to do kind of a speeded up, shorter term version of a strategic foresight to help them plan to get through the pandemic and what would come next. So the short story is there's good news about foresight, and while building up capacity and bringing in expertise and doing a full-blown foresighted study can be very expensive and time consuming, there are simple techniques that can be applied even with minimal resources. It's more opening the mind and learning some basic skills, bringing people together in workshops, facilitated discussions, using some tools. It lends itself to easy use, and it's adaptable to different cultures and countries.
Have you seen any developing country in particular using it?
I fear by mentioning a developing country, when the recording of this goes global, I'm going to be harassed for ignoring this or that country. I would say South Africa, where there are a lot of practitioners and government or semi-government agencies utilizing it, including in the West Cape. So that's the first that comes to mind. In terms of Asia, of course, some of the higher income countries, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, there's very extensive use of it. In the more, say, middle income space, the Philippines has a dynamic and growing foresight community.
All right, great. I do see a question in the chat box, which is a relevant one. Let me ask it. It's from Judith. Bart, what do you see then as the new normal? And I think I take her question to mean the new normal in terms of government having strategic foresight factored into the work that it does.
Yeah. Well, more governments are going to be using foresight, and more companies as well. A study done by the University of Houston, which is one of the few places in the world where that is invested in a master's degree program in foresight. A study that they did in the last year showed that only 1 out of 4 Fortune 500 companies had in-house capacity on foresight. And I see that percentage going up, definitely going up. Now, in terms of the new normal, maybe getting at, well, what do we see around it? What in life might be different? We could talk for 2 hours. We're not going to do that in my response to this question, but let me give you a flavor of what seems to be coming around the bend. I think we're going to see the lower birth rates in many countries that have been associated with the pandemic. They're not going to spring back to what they were before, which is going to lead to a variety of implications, including implications for population estimates and how many people will be living in the world. Digital IDs are going to become more common. Surveillance and monitoring, even in countries that are, say, open democracies and stress liberty and freedom, people have accepted greater government intervention in their lives, and that's not all going to disappear. Governments feel empowered, and they're going to be using more surveillance and more monitoring of people, eye scans and other types of scans. Face masks, which became a very politicized issue in some places like the US. Speaking on a more global level, I think we'll see face masks used more commonly during the flu season. So it will not be so strange to see more of those. Automation, if we talk about big economic changes, automation exploded and accelerated during the crisis. I'll just stop at that example, noting that that's going to impact job markets. It's going to impact how we receive services and goods. Huge implications for what students should be studying and how workers are going to have to reskill. The composition of labor markets. In one example there from the States, a company started by 2 co-founders of Skype anticipates having robot food delivery services on 100 US college campuses in time for the autumn session. So they're already testing this, and they're not the only company that has these miniature robots on wheels moving around. And so instead of having the pizza guy showing up at your door, you're going to have a robot. And this is real. This is happening, and get used to stepping around them on the sidewalks, depending on how municipalities decide to regulate the use of these robots. And that's the tip of the iceberg of the changes that have come with the pandemic that we're going to see continuing into our post-COVID lives.
Thank you, Bart. This leads me to one other question. There's such a range of possible futures one can imagine. When you are in the midst of a strategic foresight exercise, how do you sort out the difference between the things that are ideas, but they're really kind of out there and not worth paying much attention to? How do you distinguish those from ideas that are much more likely come to fruition?
Right. Part of the way you address that, it's a bit of a conundrum and involves some subjective decision making. You can limit the impact of poor choices and what goes into scenarios by involving more people. Think of the wisdom of the masses. You bring in not just some subject experts from a particular field. Say you're operating in energy like Shell was. You look outside to other expertise and you bring that in. You bring in, say, if you're with a big organization, involve a lot of your stakeholders, a lot of those in and outside the organization. So you get a percolating of ideas, and therefore I can see how different trends might interact. And choices have to be made. Some judgments have to be made to, if you're going to limit to 3-4 different scenarios. And one thing to keep in mind when you have these alternative plausible scenarios, it's very unlikely that in 10 years' time, any one of those single scenarios will be real life as we know it. But what we've seen in the last decades of using foresight is that we do see a bit of one or more of those scenarios actually coming true. So it does work. It's just you have to think through who's going to be involved in the decision making, and you look at what's plausible. That's the last point on this question. Is there's the possible, in theory, hypothetically, and then you go into black swan events that are extremely rare and unpredictable. Foresight doesn't tend to go into the more obscure or highly unlikely events. The emphasis here is on plausible. What is plausible given the interaction of the drivers of change we've identified?
All right, great. Thanks. You sparked some really good questions in the chat box. Let me try to get to some of those. From Maribeth Goodman. Can the foresight process be abused by government systems and industries or others for their own benefit and giving them power over others, or as opposed to the benefit of a global commons?
That's a great question. And I would say that I think of a case of a corporate that has lots of power. They already have the influence and the means to influence things for better or worse. A foresight study that they do, I don't see that giving them a weapon, if you will, to cause harm. If you look within an organization, yes, like so many other tools that a company can draw upon, it can be misused to, for example, force change, layoffs, what have you, if it's not done honestly and openly. And indeed, one of the reasons why foresight, despite its many benefits, is not being used as much as it probably should be, is because it presents risks. It may identify some uncomfortable, plausible futures that require change. And so when companies, for example, are using foresight, they need to be open with their staff and ideally involve them in a fairly participatory way so they feel a part of identifying these alternative scenarios that may identify change that will require big shifts in how a company operates.
So there still is this power dynamic that we're going to have to become more sensitive to, as even within an organization. Let's see, I'm going to just pick some of these questions. David will handle many of the rest of them in the second half. But Audrey says, it seems strange that the United Nations doesn't seem to take in much of this future scenario. Is there a reason for that? And do you agree with this? And if so, is there a reason for that?
I would say actually the UN, remember the UN has many specialized agencies and component parts. And some of them have put a lot of effort into strategic foresight and future studies more generally. And I would point out UNESCO, as well as the UNDP, looking more in international development. So there actually has been some very good work and continuing work with UNDP, working with developing countries and highlighting tools and approaches of foresight that might help them in their own planning. So, but the point is valid in the sense that all international bureaucracies, okay, and national bureaucracies, there is a natural wariness of rocking the boat. You know, the governments are not known as the most agile and open and forward-looking organizations in life. So I'm sure that in various parts of the UN, like in my former employer, the Asian Development Bank, there's a reluctance to embrace foresight for a variety of reasons, including what a study might yield and the thinking and decision making that might drive. Right.
It could, if foresight produced a prediction that we might be headed for a highly disruptive pandemic, people might not want to hear about it.
Yeah.
Or if it started to emerge, people might just want to pretend it's not really happening. And we've seen the consequence of ignoring trends as they emerge. Bart, thank you so much. Go ahead.
I just want one last thing, maybe in closing and coming back to the book, which I strongly encourage anyone interested in foresight to pick up. One of the what I find more interesting chapters is one of the last ones focused on post-pandemic scenarios. So I've drawn upon insights of futurists, of foresight specialists, of intelligence analysts to provide many different alternative scenarios from different exercises that have looked at in the shorter term, what may come next, say between now and 2023, 2024. So shorter than the usual foresight study, but because there is such interest and concern about what immediately is coming. So that's worth looking at. And the final remark is one of the most interesting, comprehensive foresight studies that's done on a regular basis is done by the National Intelligence Council of the United States government. And you think what the spooks are doing, a report, and how could I access that? They make it publicly available. They have huge resources and teams of experts, and they do surveys involving people around the world, and they come up with a global trends report every 4 years. The idea is to inform the public discussion as well as the government. Of course, they've got their, confidential briefings for the White House and such, but this is a public document which provides a fascinating insight into plausible global big picture scenarios. And the next version of their quadrennial report will be out within the next 2 months. So keep an eye on that. That's public, and it's a really good exposure into what foresight can really provide in the thought-provoking nature of it with big picture global questions.
But do you have a link to that in your book? Is that in the resources section?
I mention it. I'm not sure if there's an actual URL, but there's certainly a reference to it, and it's easily found after that. All
right, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay. So, Anne, let's turn to you now and talk about a real example of an event that was not well anticipated, and yet foresight could well have predicted, a global pandemic. And we'll look at your particularly intuitive, future-oriented response to it. So your book is all about a global playbook for the next pandemic. And I would start by asking, why do you say a global playbook is needed? What's wrong with the national responses that we're seeing start to emerge?
Well, thank you for that question, Tim. Thank you for the invitation. And let me first say good afternoon, good evening, and maybe good morning to our good audience. Why do we need a global playbook? Well, when I was preparing my thoughts for this book, what I was considering is what most of the audience know, that a pandemic anywhere is a pandemic everywhere, and that pandemics do not have or respect borders. And my sense was that last summer, when this book was being written, there was limited sense from nation states about the global nature of this program. And so my premise was that we won't be able to repair this roof when it starts raining again with another pandemic, and that this required a global understanding. And therefore, the title of the book, and you will, like Bart, I'm going to put it out, title of the book, the Global Playbook for the Next Pandemic. Now, today we understand it a bit better, but if I could make an illustration, 3 days ago, I took 2 flights from Washington, DC to Kampala, Uganda, where I bring greetings from. I could have carried this virus in only 18 hours up to here, which hopefully I didn't. And at this point, the question would be, the country that I'm visiting, is it going to arrange this as a national issue? It was not evident then, but I know that the audience that we have understands it much better than at the point that I was writing this book, when in fact there was no vaccine in sight. We were not even thinking that there was going to be a vaccine. And therefore, Tim, I was of the view then, and I'm of the view now, that anything that has global health emergencies cannot be addressed on a national level, on a regional level, indeed, even on a sub-regional level. And I'm glad to say that that thinking has started to bring some positive results. So that's why I had proposed a playbook back a couple months ago.
All right, thank you, Anne. And one of the things that is really unique about your approach compared to what I'm reading and looking about is you see this, that to address this isn't simply a matter of better health preparedness, but to actually address it well, the strong connection between health and human development needs to be addressed. That to fail to see the preparedness for a pandemic is going beyond health ministries of health and clinics would be a big failure. So why is this important?
Well, as somebody who's been in the development field for more than 30 years, I felt that I had an obligation to remind, especially the wealthier countries, that this pandemic is actually being run through 3/4 of nations that are still vulnerable, that are still looking for two areas of the social sector, health and education, and trying to grapple with the solutions. And so I thought that since a majority of nations would not be able to address the health issue plus the pandemic without actually thinking of the concept of alleviating poverty in their own environments or trying and creating shared prosperity, that we needed to address this pandemic and future pandemics, especially by first looking at the development agenda and looking at how, if we are going to find a solution, we could create some health, education, development nexus that would then move the majority of the developing countries, which Bart was referring to, into the picture of addressing future pandemics. Clearly, it was a bit too late for this particular one. But that's why I combined the idea of social sector with development as a solution.
And speak to education in particular. What do you see countries need to be doing in their education systems themselves to help educate students and ultimately entire populations about pandemics?
I believe that I think Bart referred to the issue of education in a much more wider sense. But for this particular case, although it's not part of the book, I have felt very strongly that if we would address the pandemic in a way that would be productive, especially for poor countries, that the educational systems that we create, the resources that we put in, the training, the communication would have to be absolutely at a higher level. And that's why, Tim, for my book, I had the playbook idea was to come up with a few concepts that we could have as nations working together. And I think that upfront, I made it clear that I call them my 4 C's, and that the first one was going to be to find a way for nations to collaborate on as the first defense of creating solutions. And of course, a good example was that we came up with the vaccines. And then I had also tried to put the book's essence on how we were going to coordinate and not do the usual competition. And this, I'm happy to say that at least when you see the vaccines, that at least is moving towards the right areas. Then communication, because it was very clear, and I have a very good example, this China virus that was being talked about in the US. And I felt that by leaders pushing for that kind of communication, clearly we were not going to have a global sense of how to solve this problem. And then finally, I thought that maybe one area that had been really not addressed was whether this was going to be a collective responsibility for the public and private sector, and not leave this only to nations, but have the public and private sector get involved. Now, why am I saying that? Because after I wrote the book, I'm happy to say that some of these issues that I had been trying to push, I can see now slowly some of the concepts have come up, and I think that as we speak today, from last summer, I see more evidence of collaboration. I see definitely cooperation among nations. We see coordination between the private sector and public sector in terms of vaccines. I think where we are lacking now is being able to talk to each other and sharing information as a global community. So that was really the playbook that I had been pushing.
And how do you see this as happening, getting us from where we are now to where we could be, in terms of what organization? Will a new international body need to be formed? Could an existing organization take it on? As somebody who spent her career inside global development organizations.
So Tim, after I was thinking on what could be the solution to having all these issues of development, social sector, cooperation come together. And my proposal was that there should be one single go-to game changer institution that would deal with the next pandemic. Because clearly we had seen, I'm talking in the past, but even present, we had seen how different institutions were doing, small things. So as we probably have seen, institutions are, the global ones are the ones that deal with public goods, whether it's climate change, whether it's population or what. So there are institutions that are there to address this. And my proposal in my book is that we get the World Bank, because where you sit is where you stand, which has deals with the social sector, has the resources, works with most of the nations, and of course is owned by all the nations. So I thought that we could create this new institution within the World Bank, because it already exists. So in fact, most of the institutions that are dealing with this issue right now in partnerships could work better if they were approaching it from a development point of view. So that's the basis of my book.
Mm-hmm. And you've also done some rough calculations. How much would it cost to set this up, to put this into action, and then to make sure that the global playbook was funded? And following that is who would do the funding?
The good news is that it is almost, there's not much cost to it. If you take an example of what has been going on with the new COVAX initiative, and you see that the nations that have been contributing to it are the same nations that contribute to these institutions like the World Bank. So it's a question of really portioning the contributions according to the same formula that is being used. And the formula is already there. How much more would it take to create a new institution? No, it exists. You use the same resources. You just ask the current formula that is used to be recalculated. In the case in my book, what I'm suggesting is that they really shouldn't be too much costing, that they should use the same structure that in one part of the social sector of the World Bank to work in partnership with other organizations to run the next pandemic programs.
So, and one of the things that I really loved about your book is you've clearly defined the problem. And what are the things that need to be done? You've pointed to the institutions that currently exist and could fill that capacity. You've just made the case that the funding is there. So what is it going to take then for the nations that are the funders of such organizations to shift their mindset and really start to see, as you said, a pandemic anywhere is a pandemic everywhere, and then act on it? I mean, I fear that in the wake of the pandemic, countries are going to say, well, we really blew our budget. Now we have to really focus on our own economic recovery. And the thought of directing money towards preparing for the next pandemic is just not going to get traction. So what will it take?
Yeah, from, the takeaway from my book and from what has happened is that the most important lesson for the nations from this pandemic is that the countries cannot do business as usual. So the world clearly understands that it needs to find a better structure to effectively and even ethically move into the next problem or global health problem that we will have. So I think that you don't need to go far to get nations convinced, because we already have this problem that we are dealing with, and therefore I think that's the impetus, that's the reason why nations are going to be convinced that they need to empower one organization. Now, in my case, I say the World Bank, but whichever organization, and to arm it, and so that it is able to create these tools that I explain in the book of of this playbook that runs the solutions not from different nations but from one institution. So I'm convinced that the playbook it would have multiple actions, but it would be run from one institution.
Right. The metaphor of the playbook really makes me see one possible good thing that could come out of this pandemic, and this is to see if everybody's following the same playbook. The countries of the world might actually get it that we are actually all on the same team. And one of the distressing things, as we've seen the pandemic in its current phase, is governments who are making sure that their populations are vaccinated first. There was problems, of course, with vaccines being produced in Europe, and then they were not being allowed to export them to other nations which had purchased them. As a Canadian myself, I know that Canada felt sort of flat-footed when it ordered vaccines and then they weren't being delivered. So even amongst the richest countries in the world, there's been vying for who gets the first doses. Sure, there's a lot of movement now towards getting vaccines for poor nations in the world, but let's face it, after our nations have been vaccinated, then we'll see about you. So there really is this have and have not dichotomy that still exists in the world, of China's being accused of vaccine diplomacy, being strategic on who it wants to give or sell vaccines to. So do you have any insight on the way forward to helping us more see this as something we're all in together, as opposed to something that could divide us into different strategic camps?
Mhm. So it would seem to me that the individualistic stand that you've just explained on the vaccine, or for that matter, on therapeutics, should be should be a lesson on the importance of a global uh, approach or a global playbook, so that we, in if we had to have an approach that I could consider as lessons learned, it would precisely be what you have just explained with the problems. For example, we have a couple of countries who have not even had a single vaccine for any of their populations. So to me, I see this as reinforcing the idea of a global community working on a specific issue like the pandemic. In a way, the problems that we have experienced in this pandemic should be the impetus for the solution to the next pandemic. You learn, you always learn from your mistakes. And so as somebody who has thought through whether what we're going through is the end, knowing very well that for sure it is not if, but when the next one will come, I see everything that you're explaining as a positive for the next approach that we will have. And that is why I think we cannot be addressing it from so many angles, that we should create one center that would then work with all these nations to create a global community.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so one center, bringing everyone together. And in terms of timing, I fear that if we wait until this pandemic is truly over, the world will simply go on, to the next issue, whatever that is. So, do you see any momentum at this point to getting something like a global summit on a future playbook?
Well, that's actually a good question, because recently there've been a lot of conversations on how to put together the conversation on a global nature. Unfortunately, the UN has had a conversation on it. There's been a lot of writing now on how we need to create one institution instead of all these scattered institutions. Of course, with the new administration in the US, there've been that sense of my message of creating a global conversation. Are we there? I thought that 6 months ago, when this book came out, that was the time we should have started. And so we are already late. Is the conversation beginning? Yes. Are we going to create a solution with vaccines and therefore forget that the next pandemic is going to come? Absolutely yes. And that is why I would want to suggest to the audience and whoever is interested, that this conversation on what we do with the next pandemic, whether it is to create a group or institution that works on it, whether it is to whatever solution, that this conversation is part and parcel of the current pandemic, and you cannot separate the two problems.
Yes, thank you, Anne. So well said. And that is bringing us to the close of our first hour. When we return after a short break, I'll turn it over to David before we do break. we'll actually begin that conversation on how can we be more foresightful and use that foresight to help us in the specific case better plan for the next pandemic, but also perhaps how can we use the reality of this pandemic to force us to think about the future better and differently? And what can each of us do? How can each of us contribute from the place where we stand to being instigators of that conversation? David, I'll turn it over to you to close and then announce the short break at this point.
Thank you so much, Tim and Anne and Bart. There are so many questions and interesting points that you've raised. So I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting discussion in the second half. And I'm going to put my oar in as well at some point. And before we open up, one of the things I'd just like to do, this is a document that some of you will be familiar with. It appears in a number of different contexts. It was a Rockefeller Foundation presentation, publication for 2010 with the Global Business Network on scenarios for the future of technology and international development. And I'm just going to read one or two passages from it because this scenario, which is called lockstep, really describes what's going on at the moment. It's quite prescient. And some people would go further than prescient, but let's just say it's prescient, and it illustrates this power of scenario planning. And one of the things it says here is that some countries did a lot better than others in terms of dealing with the pandemic, and it says China in particular. The Chinese government's quick imposition and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all its citizens, as well as its instant and near hermetic sealing off of all borders, which actually they didn't do, saved millions of lives, stopping the spread of virus far earlier than in other countries and enabling a swift post-pandemic recovery. And they actually have had a swift post-pandemic recovery. Then on the following page, it says this: during the pandemic, and this is what Bart was telling us earlier on, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. Again, Bart was stressing this. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics to transnational terrorism to environmental crises and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. And then in the next paragraph, it says, at first, the notion of more controlled world gained wide acceptance and approval. Citizens willingly gave up some of their sovereignty and their privacy to more paternalistic states in exchange for their safety and stability. And this was forecast to happen in 2012. And then a little later on, it says that by 2025, people were getting a bit fed up with this, growing weary of so much top-down control, letting leaders and authorities make choices from them. And there was a sporadic pushback and became increasingly organized and coordinated as disaffected youth and people who'd seen their status and opportunities slip away, largely in developing countries, incited civil unrest. So it's an interesting piece of scenario planning. There were other scenarios. This is one of 4 scenarios in this particular report, and the Global Business Network is well known for its scenarios. Bart, maybe you have a comment on this. I'm sure it's not the first time you've seen this publication.
David, that's an excellent selection for the discussion today. And it does highlight that while you may have alternative scenarios, and you mentioned this is just one of a handful, it's quite possible that one proves to be more true than the others or has a lot of elements of truth. And it's very striking in what you've just read, how close to reality we found ourselves. When I was talking about trends into the future, about, say, greater surveillance by the state, I do see those trends continuing, but it's not preordained, and they're in the sense that there may well be pushback, whether it's 2025 or later. In many societies not accustomed to an overbearing government that intervenes in so many aspects of life, people will reach their limits when we're beyond the immediate crisis and threat of a virus that can kill you or your relatives and loved ones. So yeah, it's the story remains to be told, but the fact is we have accepted more government intervention in countries where they're used to this, more authoritarian states. Yes, it probably contributed to an effective control of the virus. And it goes to show that you will not have the same approach to addressing a crisis like this in every country because of different societies and expectations of government and what people will accept.
Yes, and in fact, as I'm sure you know, the last piece of scenario planning that was done was Event 201 in October 2019, where again much of what has unfolded since then has actually occurred. And one of the things that, if you watch the transcript and the actual video recording, you'll see that it was thought to be necessary to control information very closely. And this is exactly the kind of censorship regime that we've seen developing, and the accusations of disinformation and misinformation when you actually question the mainstream narrative. So anyway, that's so let's go to we haven't nobody seems to put their hand up as yet. But has anybody got a question that they'd like to put live, as it were? We've got, yes, let me ask you another scenario question, and maybe Anne has a comment on this as well, and then we'll come to Jens. And this is something I don't know how many of you have seen any of this in the last 2 weeks, but there's a vaccinologist called Geert van den Bosch, who's concerned about immune escape, where the virus develops resistance to the vaccines, and the pressure, the selection pressure that's being put on the virus at the moment, from point of view of natural selection, suggests that it will mutate not to weaker versions, which is what happens if you just allow a pandemic to run its course, but may actually mutate to stronger versions, which will be one step ahead of the vaccination specification, in a similar way to what happens every year with the flu vaccines, is that you can't keep up with all the different emerging strains of flu. So you'd have to have a stab at things in relation to the prevalent and emerging strains of virus. So do you see this? Do you take seriously this idea that this immune escape could occur, and therefore we could find a worsening situation with continuing lockdowns and continuing restrictions?
Well, can I just give it a short on that? Well, first of all, I do agree with the thinking that the idea of wearing masks is a permanent lifestyle change. And I hope for those who agree on wearing masks that will continue. On the variants and whether they're going to be stronger or not stronger, or it would appear to me that as long as we are practicing what we are practicing now, which is going to be the same lifestyle that hopefully we'll live 2 years from now, then it will be, the debate is just going to be hopefully null and void, because we are going to continue to do the SOPs that we've been doing for the last one year, and I'm hoping that's what we're going to do. For those who are doubters, maybe they'll come along. So my response to you is that, yes, we don't know whether it is going to be stronger or weaker, but if we continue practicing what we have, it's almost become second nature, then that's the answer to whatever pandemic comes now with the current one or the next one. That's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose that going forward partly depends on your view on masks and how effective masks are at preventing the spread of flus and virus particles. But that we won't go there because that's a
No, no. It becomes too political.
Yeah. What about you, Bart?
Look,
immune escape. Is that a scenario you take seriously?
Well, I would like to hear others. And you're always going to have really frightening scenarios presented by one or another specialist. So I would, if we saw a few other experts, epidemiologists weighing in on this and saying, yes, this is a real risk, then I would be concerned. At the moment, it's a view and it may well be well established. But if the vaccine, at least those countries that are getting it now, start with Israel and other countries that are making great progress, even in the US, the UK, if a large part of the population is vaccinated, we're not completely out of the woods, but we're going to be in a pretty good place. As far as Anne saying, as long as we keep these practices, not just masks, but social distancing and the other things, we'll be okay. We're not going to continue all of them. People are sports fans, for example, are chomping at the bit to get to filled stadiums in Europe, North America, South America, and elsewhere, Africa. People want to congregate. They want to go to concerts and festivals and crowded restaurants. So people are going to get out, and not all jurisdictions will maintain restrictions in terms of spacing of tables or wearing masks indoors or what have you. So I just don't see a maintenance of the restrictions which are already being lifted in the case of the US and many individual states. So let us hope that the vaccine squashes and contains the virus, and we don't have this threatening emergence of something that's more lethal. I will say this, it's going to happen, hopefully not in the short term, that we have the spread of another virus that will be much more threatening. And I refer, for example, to the example in Contagion, which was, okay, it's a movie, it's fiction. I know somebody who was involved in that, advising from a scientific standpoint. And it's not that much of an extrapolation of what's possible. That is a virus that spreads fast and is much more lethal than the one we've just had. We're going to face a scenario like that. And one of the hopes is that looking at the positive, the vaccine producers, manufacturers in different jurisdictions, in different contexts, have come up with solutions with vaccines in a year, when this used to take 4, 6, 10 years. So when we face the next crisis, hopefully we can respond very quickly as well, and have in place better coordinated and collaborative systems to share information, to avoid the disinformation problem that you cited.
Yes, well, I think we won't go down the rabbit hole, which you could easily go down, by going into more detail on that. So we'll take Jens next, from Sweden.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you're looking a bit dark. There's not a lot of
Yeah,
light.
I'm in a not so well lit room.
Yeah, okay.
It's a dining room. But in any case, I was trying to write a paper myself on the future of communication last year, and I had two big problems, which I would like to hear your comments on. Perhaps primarily Bart, I'm not sure, we'll see. What is the relative weight of unforeseen versus foreseen? When I was thinking about the future of digitalization and communication, it seemed to me that a lot of even you mentioned surveillance is one thing that was partly foreseen apparently by someone 10 years ago, but not 20 years ago, I think. And the reactions to surveillance, such as acceptance, non-acceptance, feeling a need for it, etc. But it's not just surveillance, it's criminality, it's a vulnerability of communication, which on a large scale is hitting us now and then. And there are many other issues which were totally unforeseen. So one way to think about this is to think what was foreseen 20 or 30 years ago. And of the few predictions that we might be able to find, how many of them have turned out? Has anybody done that study? The other issue that I also had to struggle with was the relationship between planned development and self-organized development. And it seems to me that even if we are able to spot some of the driving forces, it's still very hard. I mean, it seems that most of what happens is actually self-organized and not planned. So what are your reactions to that?
Thank you.
I would actually, I have a couple of thoughts, but I'd like to turn to Tim. Although he was moderating last session, he is a global expert on communications and knows a thing or two that, and may well have a perspective on this.
I think right now, from a communications point of view, we're in the midst of a global revolution all on its own that we've seen in the last few years in the US around disinformation online. And that to me overshadows everything else that we're going through. Communication is far more available now at a global level. Look at us today. But the risk is our brains have nowhere near adapted from it. And the big challenge is we accept a lot of things as true if they match with our cognitive biases, our expectations, our desires for how things ought to be. And we end up being more paralyzed to actually address things that are, but are inconvenient or we don't like. So the challenges around global digital communication are massive, and I am hopeful because we have emergencies like this one, which are forcing key people to communicate in new ways. But I think we're like toddlers behind the wheel of a race car when it comes to our new abilities to communicate.
Thank you. And I think one person's information is another person's disinformation.
Oh, it looks like
well, I mean,
the other questioner wants to add something.
Well, he's consistency with what you just said, you know, that we the confirmation bias means that we look for what supports our view rather than questioning it. Bart, did you have something to say? And then
Sure.
I think Jens wants to come back.
Sure. I appreciate Jens' question about past predictions, forecasting, what have you, and do we have a sense of whether they were accurate or not? Who's done like an evaluation of them? Is there a general evaluation? Well, I guess it would depend on what sphere are you talking about, because there have been forecasts and alternative scenarios for just about every aspect of life, and you just you start searching for them, and of course you will find lots of examples where those trying to figure out where in a particular field on a certain topic things are going to go, they were way off the mark. On the other hand, sometimes, and David, the example you cited of this one particular of various scenarios that seemed to be pretty spot on, done a decade ago by sponsored by Rockefeller and Company. So it's a bit all over the map. One other, just to spread the thinking a bit further, sometimes for those in strategic foresight or future studies more generally, will actually turn to those in the science fiction writing community for ideas, because there are no bounds to that. You're not coming with a set of tools and practical strategy for a business organization. You can go anywhere you want. And if you go back into science fiction writing in the 19th century, movies from decades ago, certainly not everything that they envisioned has come to life, but there are a lot of examples where things that were not seen as possible. And this gets you at your question, Jens, unforeseen. Well, what is unforeseen? Oftentimes, when we try to look forward and we just didn't see that, is what are you looking at? And I would say we have to expand the box a little bit and look how different drivers outside of, in this case, communications and information sharing might interact to create new possibilities. The future is not just more of what we have today, but an interaction of things that we haven't necessarily put together, thought how they might interact to create something that on the surface may be unforeseen, but with a little bit of, I guess, creativity, we could see possibilities of something like that emerging.
Yeah, someone will have thought of it. Anne, did you want to come in, Hez, or Jens, do you have something more you'd like to add?
No, it's fine. We can move on.
Okay. I'm going to take a,
David, if I may,
yeah, sure.
there is a
Take
fabulous
question
book
from-
on exactly the point that Bart raised, called Science Fiction: The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future, by Tom Lombardo, who I think some of
Oh yeah,
you may know.
yeah,
Fabulous book, and it's all about how science fiction is a tool that we as humans have developed to help us foresee the future. Brilliant book. All right, that's my plug for Tom Lombardo.
Yeah, I'm meaning to send it on to somebody who's more of a specialist than myself, to review. But now that's so complicated, sending any books anywhere from France after Brexit. I'm going to read Suzanne Taylor's question here, which is: do you see the necessity, because of automation, where there won't be enough jobs, no matter what, for something like universal basic income? And I think this we should be having, with the context of this, I think we should be having a society-wide debate about work and belonging and a sense of purpose, because it's not just the economic aspect of this, that in order for people to feel good about themselves, they need to be able to contribute and feel they're valued. And so I think the kind of subtext of this needs to be thought about as well, especially in relation to the mental health crisis that we have, and particularly among young people. So what are your thoughts on universal basic income within that kind of wider context?
Well, I'll share.
Yeah,
Sorry.
on you go.
I'll share a couple of thoughts. I'd be interested in Anne's perspective, having worked with the World Bank and African Development Bank for many years. It's interesting. Well, one of the trends that has been with us is inequality, and it's exacerbated. The rich have gotten much richer in the pandemic times, even as many have suffered, and well over 100 million people globally have been thrown into extreme poverty. So it is an issue, and it's building social tensions and presenting a risk to stability of governments and threatening the social fabric in many places. So, I mean, that's just one instrument. It's getting a lot of attention, the universal basic income. Whether it's that instrument or another, we're going to see increasing focus on inequality, and automation is only a part of it. Yes, automation, we can see factually that it's eliminating some jobs and threatening to displace many others. But it's going back to the mention of the steam engine and such. The jobs will disappear, but new ones will emerge, right? So the question becomes, for those who lose their employment, or they've been studying for something that is disappearing as an option, what are we doing in terms of society and government policy to equip those people for meaningful work? So this gets at skills building, building up that social protection network, which may involve universal basic income. But I would resist the simplistic headline that you see screaming on many tabloids, and that the robots are here to take our jobs. It's not as simple as that. We're going to see turbulence in the labor market, as we have always seen, although it's going to be accelerated on a more significant scale, and it's going to affect inequality. So we collectively need to take action to ensure that we are not leaving people behind. And this is a worry for me. In developed countries, it is a significant concern. It's not that automation is evil. It's how we as society are accommodating and planning for that, and making sure people are not thrown into the gutter, so to speak, and left without hope or employment, livelihood opportunities.
And I think it applies particularly to those with fewer skills. And the new element of this, I think, is that some of the middle class professional jobs are going to be affected as well, which hasn't been the case in the past. Anne, what are your thoughts on this?
So, my thoughts are that the future of work has always shifted over several decades, because I recall about 8 years ago, the issue of automation was supposed to take over, and jobs, at least in the industrial economies, were going to completely disappear. However, it seems to me that in the countries that I generally work with, the issue of things like automation or this recent, universal payment, which even in the US they're talking about, is something that is not even being contemplated, and we are still dealing with how basic we can have employment for those who don't know, have skills, which goes back to what we were talking about with Tim about education. So skilled labor, having the disparities in incomes, especially in poor countries, creating employment through different interventions is what really concerns most of those countries in poor income levels. So I think that the future of work has to be calibrated according to the different economic structures of countries, and that what the current debate, the debate about universal income is really for specific countries. And for those that cannot even contemplate that, the issue is how to expand the pie and find employment that is at the same level of the skills of your population. So I guess I could conclude by saying that none of us really have ever gotten it right, but it is a subject that is outright number one on every government's agenda. And it's just about time that we figured out, depending on the economic structure and the economic level you are at in your country, it's about time we figured out how to create employment. But I've never bought any of the, this is the in thing.
Yeah, thank you very
really
much.
no right or wrong answer.
Some of you might have come across the books by the Susskind family, the Daniel Susskind and Jamie Susskind. They're Oxford University economists, and one of them's called Future Work, and the other one's called Future Politics. And they're both published by Oxford University Press, and really excellent. I might see if I can upload a review into the chat in a moment. There isn't one more question for you, Anne, from Judith. Then we'll go to Jim. Is there anyone trying to lead from the private sector to bring immediate assistance on a large scale to seriously struggling spots in such as Brazil, where the population follows the government, but they would like more availability for vaccines than they've got at present? I think that's what Judith is getting at, but she can clarify if I've got it wrong. I'm just reading what she said here.
I mean, Judith, the information I have, I think, is the same that you have, that the politics of Brazil has come ahead of the health and science as it used to be a couple months ago in the US. And the fact that the economic structure has not been able to support both the social, the health aspects of the kind of services that is provided has really, hindered what the country can do. So for Brazil, all I know, and I'm not an expert on that part of the world, is that it's a very unfortunate, it's a perfect storm of politics, poor health systems, and I think that the nationalization of a problem that should be a global problem, because there's no reason why we are having so many people being coming from the US, where everybody's being begged to have vaccines, when just a couple hours in Brazil, people are just dying like flies. So this really goes back to my concept of, unless you have a global village, you're going to have the Brazils. It actually breaks my heart when I hear how so many people in the Amazon are just dying off, while, you know, in Washington, DC, they are begging people, going door by door, can we vaccinate you? Let me leave it here. I hope
Okay.
I've answered your question.
Very different scenario. Jim, you have a point or question.
Oh, yes, thank you. And I just want to thank everybody for this. This has been phenomenal. So my question builds on some of the comments in the thread as well, where it relates to what was just said about global, but it gets to global versus local, and even like nation versus state and locality and neighborhood. A lot of foresight and even strategic planning, which can be embedded in foresight, can be viewed as being a bit elitist and academic. And a lot of the work deals with what nations will do. And I'm thinking about COVID in the United States, but this is true in some other countries, where even the best foresight at the national level, so much of what we do is not only state-based, but in our neighborhoods, about shutdowns and wearing masks. And we could have had best foreign and even global policies, but unless we're doing stuff from the grassroots level and the local level, we may not impact change. So my question is this: how can we apply foresight and better connect global issues with bottom-up foresight planning and action at the local level, community level?
Very good question. Who'd like to take that one?
I'll weigh in. Superb question. And yeah, I guess the examples that we've been citing, part of it has to do with where Ann and I are coming from, tend to be at the international level or national level. But foresight is not just for those in the ivory tower or in national capitals. Let me give you an example. There's a program at a community center in Jackson, Mississippi. Mississippi is one of the poorest states in the United States. And this program targets children between the ages of 8 and 17. And it draws heavily upon the public schools, where you have a lot of disadvantaged children, frankly, living in poverty in Jackson, Mississippi. And this community-based program is teaching them basic skills with a future orientation, so IT skills and the like. And there's a component on strategic foresight. They're using techniques like what's called the futures wheel, of looking how different potential events and trends may interact. Just to highlight that this is the tools of foresight can be used at other levels, and they in fact are being used at other levels. I'll cite just one other example. Coming to the UK, in 2015, a network was set up called the Future Cities Foresight Research Network, bringing together universities, economic development agencies, municipalities, and other stakeholders, communities, to do planning for cities in the future, to share good practice and to look into the future with a view toward shaping the city in a way that people would like to see it in, say, around 2050. And so there's for example, a case study out of Reading, looking at 2050 and using participatory visioning. So bringing in not just these, the organizations leading the community, the public sector leaders, but more widely, in a more grassroots fashion, welcoming others to the discussion and how to shape a community for the future. So an excellent point, excellent question. And I think some of this just hasn't gotten enough attention. And part of it is a lack of knowledge of how foresight can help at different levels of society and government.
Thank you. And would you like to add anything now?
No, it's fine. I think Bart has done a great job.
Good. Tim, there's one for you in the chat here about digital communications. What are the risks that we are now too dependent on digital communication, digital archives and data sources in a world where they are dependent upon a stable physical environment, but the physical environment is going to become unstable through global warming? What work is going on to understand this risk and prepare for it in everyday scenarios and also emergencies?
I shall write a 400-page book to answer that question.
Ah, right. Okay.
I would, however, like to link it to Bart's answer to Jim's question, which is the importance of local communities. Indeed, we may be headed towards a collapse of the internet if things misalign, right? So the internet is a wonderful tool for communicating on a global level, to have different people connect across the world. But if we do this at the sacrifice to our local lives and our real lives, in a sense, we are really going to be screwed. And especially during the pandemic, I think a lot of our local connections have frayed. And in the recovery of the pandemic, I hope that one of the things that comes out of it is people being able to disconnect from their advices, unless the Science and Medical Network is holding a seminar, and really be more connected and more engaged and more involved in their communities and the personal connection with the folks right next to them. If we lose that and become merely nodes in a global machine, I think not only will our humanity suffer, but we will let ourselves in for disaster if we're not able to address those bigger issues and the very real reality that our whole connectivity, our whole global system depends on a stable environment. And we are eating away at that environment every day. Brilliant question. I'll get right to work on the longer book.
Thank you. Well, personally, I've become more connected to my local people, my local neighbors and neighborhood during this time. There's another question related to this, which is Mary Beth Goodman saying that I've understood most effective change would occur at the local grassroots level, communities coming together, and so on. And of course, there's two really different lenses here, because there's the globalization world institutions level, and then there's the local, what I call glocalization as opposed to globalization, and there is a kind of divide in world view here, in my opinion, which we talked about a week ago in our evolutionary visions seminar. Because on the one hand, you've got the what's really a corporatocracy, I think, because governments are really the corporations are so powerful that they fund the politicians, and so that the influence of the big everything is enormous. You've got big tech, big ag, big pharma, big energy, big food, big chemicals, and the kind of resurgence that, and regeneration that let's say Satish Kumar was talking about on Wednesday, and that Vandana Shiva would be talking about. They're people who feel that these corporations have got too much power, and it's driven by money, and that we actually need somehow to take this back and to have a more regenerative understanding, or more regeneration revolution. Some people are using this phrase. So I see there's a lot of tension in the system, looking at these sort of more local grassroots, organic little food markets and so on, and then the global players who really are influencing the large political decisions. Any thoughts on that? Or are you going to take it as a comment? Which is fine. Tim, let's go to you.
I'm taking that as a comment, David.
Sorry,
I think that's
Tim.
Oh, yeah.
So we're now going to Worcestershire.
Hello, Anne, Bart, Tim, David, and all the folks. Many thanks indeed for a most interesting webinar. I've really appreciated the question from Jim, because it highlights the tension between the communal, big communal, the global, and the individual. But my main point is, surely the big one is climate change. Okay, we've focused on the pandemic, but the big one is the climate change. And I have no answers. I just want to put it on the table. because, to use Jim Garrison's expression, I mean, do we have the radical collaboration to make a difference? Because I know that we've, lots of examination of assumptions, which Bart has talked about in the sort of part of the strategic foresight. The horizon scan is already giving us the weak signals, more than weak signals. They're strong signals. So we need to look at the drivers of change. And I just think, are we ready as a species to contemplate population control, food sustainability, migration? These are going to be the big ones. So no answers, just want to put the big one on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Any responses? I mean, this is the poly crisis. It's the big question and systemic question, obviously.
I'll be foolish enough to weigh in on a small topic. Yeah, and I personally think that this is the biggest issue facing humanity. There are other shorter term risks. One can look at North Korea and its nukes, the pandemic we're dealing with, and many others. But it all, in the longer term, it all kind of fades into insignificance if we destroy the planet and everybody and everything living on it. I have to say I'm cautiously optimistic about some of the things I've seen in the last year on climate change. You've seen a lot of grassroots mobilization using the global connections and internet and virtual communications to take action. You've seen a whole series of announcements of targets and commitments by leading financial institutions, by large corporations, Green New Deals in Korea and the European Union, a commitment of the new US administration to bring about a transformational change in the energy sector in the US and support for climate change. Some of this, is not locked in, and sustained pressure is required. And coming back to the grassroots, mobilization of people in their communities and changing the way that we live individually is going to be important. One other, again, trying to be a little bit glasses half full here, which is my general orientation, looking at the growth of e-vehicles, replacing in 10 years' time, in developed countries, the idea of having a vehicle that operates on gasoline it won't exist, or it'll be the exception on its way out. So there are a number of positive signs. What the concern I have is that the technology that's available, it's there, resources, lots of resources. It's that we may not move quickly enough because of vested interests in those who are not convinced that of the urgency, and it is an urgent matter. But there are some hopeful signs that just need some bolstering by all of us.
I would agree that definitely there is light at the end of the climate change conversation, because 20 years ago, for those of us of our generation, there had been so much resistance. And in my view, I believe it is because it is very clear now that climate change has impact across generations, and the young generation has decided to take up that interest. That, combined with the kind of areas that Bart has talked about, should give us some hope. Yeah, I think there's hope for many reasons. I'm positive about this particular subject. Now, we just need to keep the momentum on different levels.
Thank you. And I can recommend, this is a book I reviewed in the last issue, which I think is a very important statement, and which is also about security more generally, by Mikhail Gorbachev, What is at Stake Now? And I strongly recommend having a look at that. Another question, which I think is really one of human psychology, and we've seen this very evident in the last year, is that we're kind of wired to react to emergencies. And so if something isn't an emergency, then even though there are in fact more serious problems than the immediate coronavirus in terms of all sorts of other issues, and the more people dying actually from other causes, that our eye is not on that ball. And so it seems we need a real development of our anticipatory intelligence, to be seeing everything within the bigger picture, rather than getting the telescope out and looking in through all the microscopes, so that we're seeing what's immediately in front of us, without actually realizing the larger context and the systemic nature of everything that we're dealing with. I can see some nodding heads, and so we'll take that one as read, as it were. Eileen Conn, neighborhood action is important, and I would recommend that if you don't know about the Peckham Vision website, this is neighborhood health, which might have influenced the way that the National Health Service was set up in the 1940s, but didn't, unfortunately. And this is really more about the maintenance of health and the families and health, and the reinforcement of health and healthy lifestyles and so on, as opposed to disease management, which is what we have largely focused on in our national health services. Question, what can we do as ordinary citizens? I think this goes back to our original Word document. Let me just revisit the questions here. So short-term fixes, we've talked about that. How can we actually improve as a species on prioritizing the future? Well, we've been also talking about that. What do we owe to future generations? And we've actually been, so I think we have been covering these questions at the beginning. What can ordinary citizens do? How do we unite? Any thoughts on, this is the grassroots pressure, I suppose, that is part of the way forward.
Well, I think we have seen people coming together, notwithstanding the restrictions on interacting and mingling for a time with quarantines and lockdowns. This is the positive aspect of the virtual communications, which allow people to interact, whether it's at the community level or across borders. I wanted to actually bring Tim into the conversation here. He's probably dying to chime in, because the book that I've written and the one that Anne has written is part of a series of how to reset to make a better, more just, environmentally sustainable world. And there are one or two publications in particular that are fantastic at what, answering the question, what can we do individually? One focused on, I'm thinking in particular on inequality, which relates to injustice, and another one on what you can do to address the environmental challenge linked with climate. Tim, can you just give us a quick reference to a book or two?
Sure, Bart, thanks for teeing me up. So yeah. Power Switch is the first book that Bart mentioned, and it's by Paul O'Brien, who's just recently become the Secretary General for Amnesty International USA. And it is a look at inequality and particularly what activists can do. But what I've loved with some of the other books in the series that address climate change is they're actually looking at climate change and inequality as two halves of the same human conundrum, and really seeing that the focus on a technological fix to climate and how do we get more EVs, rather than looking at how do we address the disempowerment that is part of inequality that is affecting most people on the planet. How do we make everybody see climate change is actually a human issue rather than a technological issue? And only when people, all of us, are working towards creating new systems are you actually going to get the kinds of changes that you need. It can't be expected that, as one of the other books put it, that the system that built the problem is the system that is then going to solve the problem. That book is called A Chicken Can't Lay a Duck Egg.
Yes, I have that one over there.
Yeah, makes a brilliant point. And we actually have one of our other authors on the call today. Alan Miller is one of the authors of Cut Super Climate Pollutants Now, which actually shows that we have been quite successful in coming together as a global community to solve environmental problems, specifically the Montreal Protocol, which has done a great job at solving the ozone depletion crisis. There is a small group of chemicals that if we can work globally to contain and control, we can actually buy ourselves some time to do the important work of bringing down CO2 emissions. Methane, black carbon, and some HFC refrigerants are the main groups of those chemicals. So They're putting out a path where you can actually create quick, deft action if you get global cooperation. I think for me, part of this is bringing together all of these disparate problems and not seeing that economists need to solve the problem of job creation and climate specialists need to solve a climate problem and education specialists, well, they should just worry about the classroom. We really have to start to pull these together. And I really love Judith's comment, which was, if we can cooperate in the vital immediate threat of the pandemic and get organized for the next pandemic, then maybe we'll be able to move on to climate issues. What I love about this idea is something immediate will help us focus. And once we see that we can work together, the possibility of taking on further into the future foresight requiring problems becomes more possible.
Thank you, Tim. I think that's very well put. And so we really need to enhance our ability to collaborate and cooperate with each other. And I remember giving a talk at the start of a school prize giving about 10 years ago. And I said to the young people that your generation is going to have to be the best ever at cooperating and collaborating. We live on this one mind, one planet, one health. And it's all been, brought home to us in no uncertain terms in the last year or so. So we're just coming up to the end now. So I'd like to thank all of you, Tim for bringing it all together, Anne and Bart for your very thoughtful and highly informed comments and in this sort of this hugely complex area and set of issues that we're looking at. Because I think we have to be thinking together and planning together and imagining together, but also more importantly, maybe for the good of all. Not just for the good of the small numbers of people or the wealthy or the elites, or that we need to be thinking about ourselves as brothers and sisters and really striving to see what we can all do for the common good. And with something that's come up a lot in the last minute, and really making what we do as an expression of love and kindness and being helpful to each other. And Peter Dunoff, who's my great spiritual mentor, said that if we could take mutual aid and helping each other and put that at the center of our society, the world would be a different place. So thank you very much for your vision and for your contributions. And thank you for hosting it, Nikolai. And thank you everybody for coming. And we'll look forward to seeing many of you at our next week's events, Sally Gerner, and on into the Galileo Commission and so forth. So thank you all very much.